Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar on breaking through big church growth barriers. Our goal today through the webinar is just to give you some really practical strategies to help your leadership team overcome the unique challenges larger churches face when momentum stalls out. And I know that for many of you, it's hard to imagine momentum stalling out with the growth season that you've been in. But when the lids do hit, we find it's commonly around these big attendance barriers. So before we jump into the content, let me do some quick introductions. Of course, my name is Sean. I'm the Director of Consulting here at the Unstuck Group, and I've been on the team here for 8 years now. As a part of our leadership team, helping pastors just step into consulting process to address the health of their church overall. And today I'm joined by, as always, my teammate, Amy Anderson. Amy's been on the team here at the Unstuck Group since 2015 and currently serves in the role as our managing director. During that time, she has personally served more than 200 churches, helping them design ministry strategy, staffing and structure strategy, and multi-site strategy to align their team and really fuel the mission of the church. So, Amy, thanks for joining me once again.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be talking about this today, Sean. I would estimate that 75% of the churches I served this past year were not stuck because of decline, but rather because they were growing. And so they were feeling stuck actually because of growth. And we say all the time that you can get stuck anywhere on the church life cycle. And ironically, sometimes it's growth that's becoming your barrier to future growth. So yes, I hope we can share some very practical strategies to help our participants break through big church barriers.
That's same for me, Amy. What actually leads to stuckness in most of these churches that I've been working with is all of those problems that come up related to growth, right? And they can be just as frustrating as the problems that come along with a lack of health and decline. So navigating through those just as important. Well, of course, every quarter we release our latest research in the form of the Unstuck Church Report. And over the last few years, they've told a pretty encouraging story, each of these reports. On average, churches connected to our tribe are seeing double-digit percentage growth. In fact, when we look back at the last 13 quarters now, attendance growth has landed somewhere between 13% and 30%. It's just incredible.
That's incredible.
We never would have thought we would have been here when the pandemic hit back in 2020, right? But if we're honest, not every church is experiencing that kind of momentum. And some that are actually starting to feel stuck or even losing ground now.
Sean, I like that you said starting to kind of feel stuck. I think leaders sometimes get a gut feel about things like that because I think leaders sense stuckness first. And so for our participants today, if you're sensing momentum slowing down or stalling out, it's something to pay attention to. You know, when growing churches hit attendance of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, they often face some specific challenges that can stall growth if we don't kind of get proactive and address it. And that's what we're going to help you think through today.
That's right. So today we want to help kind of drive you towards a decision. And that decision is to commit to one key practice that you can own for the rest of this year that'll help get momentum going again in your church if you're hitting one of those lids. You're not going to be able to address all of these things at once, but you can get clear on what needs to change and your role specifically in helping lead that change. So there are 3 different conversations we're going to have as we go through this, and we're going to go in order. Conversation 1 is going to be about how to recognize when you're hitting the 1,000 or 2,000 attendance ceiling. Conversation 2, we're going to focus on key practices of churches who break through these growth barriers. And then in the third conversation, we're going to look at some of the vital signs to monitor as you continue to grow. Before we get into the content, just a few other kind of housekeeping things. First of all, we have chat and live Q&A going in the Zoom room. You can use chat to just interact with those others on the call and our team. You can use Q&A to submit questions for our live Q&A that Amy and I will do at the end of our call today. Of course, like always, we have a companion workbook to go with today's conversation. You can download that at the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. And then if you'd like to share today's conversation on social media, you can do that. Use Twitter. I'm just going to call it Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it. You can call it which one. And then Facebook, those 2 platforms, and use the hashtag UnstuckChurch. Okay, hashtag UnstuckChurch. All right. Let's dive into conversation number one, how to recognize when you're hitting that 1,000 or 2,000 attendance ceiling. Amy, let's start here by just kind of talking through how church leaders can recognize when they're hitting those growth barriers of 1,000 or 2,000. What are some of the maybe key symptoms or warning signs that they should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, great question, Sean. Churches hitting these barriers typically experience several common symptoms. The first one here, they're experiencing obviously a slowdown in growth, either a softening of year over year growth, or in some cases, a legit plateau.
Yeah.
They're typically running the plays and strategies that they used to, which resulted in typically double digit growth. And those strategies got them to this point, and yet attendance has stalled for a while now. Second, I would say staff leaders are starting to feel overwhelmed and they're just working very hard, maybe harder than they have in the past, while seeing the returns actually diminish some. So typically people are burning out a bit because the systems again and the leadership styles that work at a previous size of church, a smaller church, are breaking down under the increasing complexity of being a church at that size. And lastly, another symptom could be that decision making has become more complicated and slow. At this size, the lead and the executive pastor, they can't make every decision anymore. But there's often no like clear established process for decision making. Or sometimes there aren't trusted people with the proven leadership to hand decision rights off to. That's what I see a lot as well. They just don't know who they can pass it to. So, and this shows up obviously when there's kind of a significant leadership gap between the executive leaders and the ministry leaders, but unclear decision rights or more complicated ones show up. And I think it's also worth noting, Sean, that some churches at this size still struggle with board dynamics. So typically boards at these size churches, they need to make this shift from management to kind of getting in the weeds to governance. But that transition can be really difficult if roles aren't defined.
Yeah, that's very true. One other thing I think it's worth talking about, Amy, is that many churches in this stage or phase of their life cycle find themselves surprised that they're actually, when they go through our Unstuck Church assessment, showing up in what we call the maintenance phase. And part of the reason it's a little bit confusing and shocking is that honestly, a lot still looks healthy when you've moved into the maintenance season. But like you mentioned, Amy, earlier, there's often a softening in the attendance growth that's starting to happen. We just looked at in the Unstuck Church report that released a few weeks ago that growing churches generally are growing at 10% more year over year now. And so when that attendance starts to soften, there's still growth happening, but maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 3%. It's not like it was. And we start to see the slowing down of attendance growth in our church. We also see there's less people crossing the line of faith for the first time. That's a hallmark of maintenance-based churches. And I'll talk about one of the reasons why in just a second. Interestingly, giving can still be very strong in these churches.
Yeah, it often is. It often is.
Yeah, it's one of the key reasons why leading change can be so difficult in this season, because we can look at giving and say, well, I mean, things are still working, right? We're still able to fund ministry. We're still healthy there. But there are a lot of positive momentum in these metrics, but it's not like it once was. It's not like that high momentum season where we were growing and building systems. So part of the reason for this slowdown is there's a tilt towards an inward focus in these churches and away from what likely drove that past growth, which was the outward focus on people who are outside the faith and outside the church. And part of why we were seeing maybe a higher level of life change happening in the past because of that outward focus. So, Amy, I'm going to spend just kind of a few minutes drilling down on the structural or people problems that are good indicators that a church is facing a growth barrier, since these, I think, can be a lot less clear than declining attendance or declining baptisms in a church.
So I think as we talk about structural or kind of people problems at this 1,000 mark, maybe I would start here. Up until this point, most ministry team leaders have probably been doing ministry. But with growth, they just aren't able to keep up. And this is the size when most staff are saying the church needs more staff. We need to hire more people, right? In the run to 1,000, this is where churches actually become significantly overstaffed. I shared in the podcast from our third quarter Unstuck Church report, these churches on average are staffing at one full-time equivalent for every 45 people that attend their church. So target is 75 to 1. So it's almost half of that. So that would mean double the number of staff. So they probably
Yeah.
don't need more staff.
Yeah.
Uh, but they likely probably need to start working and leading differently. Specifically, they need to raise the bar on their leadership and begin doubling down on building up the body to do the ministry. And again, when a church is smaller, doing is just easy. Doing ministry is
Hmm.
easy. But as the church grows, this underdeveloped muscle of giving the ministry to the body actually gets exposed. So that's the first one that comes to mind. So one of the key tensions in this stage is pace. Everyone feels really, really busy as we are climbing to 1,000. And in
Hmm.
that busyness, along with the new complexities that come with being a church at that size, is that there doesn't seem to be like there's time to get anything done outside the whirlwind. And that term whirlwind comes from the book Four Disciplines of Execution. And they define the whirlwind as what represents the daily tasks and responsibilities, urgencies that consume the attention and energy of teams and individuals. So
Hmm.
in my world, when I was on a church team, the whirlwind was our weekend services.
Yeah.
And whatever your whirlwind is, it's just that those can consume us and leave us like no time to get our eyes above the waterline and work on the ministry. So keep an eye on the pace. I think that's a challenge in this stage. And then another common problem at this size is that the staff structure, it's typically pretty flat with large span of care for a few leaders. In other words, as we've grown and we've added staff, we've just added them on to the couple of leaders we began with. And so to
Hmm.
break this barrier, churches need to change from a flat organization to a more tiered approach with clear leadership levels. You need ministry leaders in place who are actually like directors who can truly lead and conduct their ministry area with some autonomy while staying aligned with the overall vision. So if you're lacking those, if you're lacking those tiers, if we're staying super flat, that's going to create a barrier to growth for you.
That's good. That makes a lot of sense. So that's the barrier for churches of 1,000-ish,
Yeah.
to 2,000. What about that 2,000 growth barriers? Churches are approaching that. Are there structural or people problems the same there? Different?
Mm-hmm. There could be some similarities for sure, but here's a few more I'd mention at the 2000 point. First is around the lead pastor's role and the teaching strategy. Again, up to this point, most churches at this size have probably ridden a wave of success that has had a high reliance on the personality and the gifting of the lead pastor. Typically,
Hmm.
teaching teams have not been established yet. It's more like the lead
Right.
pastor teaches kind of 40 to 48 times a year. Then there's random one-off people who teach, in the pulpit in those off
Hmm.
weeks. And that's going to be difficult to sustain if they really want to get beyond the 2000 mark. And there are some exceptions, of course. But John, I don't think the lead pastor can carry 48 weekends a year if they're going to lead a
Right.
church that's that large, right? So as the
Yeah.
church grows and scales up, so will the lead pastor role. And that's
That's so
one
important.
key, isn't it? Yeah. Well, we
Yeah.
both lived it and watched it. It's just one key shift.
Hmm.
For a season, we need the lead pastor to spend time developing new teachers, bring them along with you in your process of writing your messages. Don't just like delegate the tasks to teach, include them.
Yeah.
I remember,
Yeah.
Sean, when our pastor shifted from carrying most of the teaching load to build a teaching team. And he started with just one additional teacher who taught, 10 to 12 times a year. And then he added one more subsequently after that.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you what,
Hmm.
the teaching got better. It was more creative. And that's in part, I think, because all three teachers had time to work on their messages, to prepare them. Plus, with three teachers, it also increased the diversity and the reach of the weekend because we had different stages of life, different stories, different perspectives. So lead
Yeah.
pastors to create space to lead a church this size and that you aren't becoming the lid. I would strongly encourage you to reduce your teaching load to perhaps 35 to 40 weekends a year and then start viewing your role as a leader differently, right? Build that teaching team and then just recognize you're leading a very large organization now. So we need to
Yeah.
rethink what that role looks like. And then just to say it again, Sean, if the board is still structured around management, this needs to change. Again, I don't see it as often anymore, but I know it exists. But boards at this size, they have to shift to focusing on governance, like guarding the established mission and vision, making
Hmm.
significant financial decisions, advising the lead pastor as requested on strategic
Yeah.
matters, and not micromanaging daily operations. This is really the
Hmm.
responsibility of the lead pastor and their staff. So I believe that those are the structural changes, like the teaching team and the right board structures, that these churches trying to break through 2000 can hit a ceiling where growth becomes impossible because those systems just can't support more people.
That's so good. I think that piece that you just talked us through on the focus of the lead pastor is so critical in this season. It reminds me of our friend Michael Moore, who pastors a great church in Alabama.
Yeah.
And he was talking to us and mentioned, his experience was he really couldn't lead his church with clarity and vision if he was always in meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it for him was understanding the scope of what he needed to be responsible for and where only he could carry decision rights as his
Mm-hmm.
church grew and scaled up. And so understanding your role as the lead pastor and some of those areas that you can begin to develop other leaders, like in the teaching area, so critical at this point in the life of your church.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to take a moment just to give you an opportunity to reflect here after conversation one. And here's what I'd like you to do. Identify a symptom or two that stand out to you as an indicator that your church is approaching a growth barrier. What are just one or two symptoms that you're feeling right now that you would articulate? This might be one of those signs that Sean and Amy just talked through that indicates we're at a growth barrier. So we'll give you about 30 seconds, write that down, and then we're going to come back with our second part of this conversation. Now that we understand some of the warning signs, let's talk about what actually works to break through these barriers. Amy, what are the key practices that you've seen in churches that successfully navigate the 1,000 or 2,000 attendance barrier?
Yeah, well, churches that break through these barriers, they consistently implement several key practices that I want to run through. The first is they double down on leadership development. In other words, they get focused and very intentional around leadership development. They recognize we cannot hire our way to health. Health comes when we have pastors and ministry leaders focused on building teams and equipping the body to be the church. So, what does that look like?
Hmm.
First, they identify a staff leader who can champion leadership development. It's not usually their sole responsibility, but they pick someone, they pick a leader who's going to own this, because we know this: if everyone owns it, nobody does. So this
That's
leader
right.
would then focus on developing the systems that'll help the church identify, develop, and deploy leaders at all levels in the organization. Again, just hiring people to fill immediate needs will not help you break through larger growth barriers. You have to
Hmm.
install great leadership development systems. And on a positive note, by the way, when you get this muscle developed, when you have this leadership development culture in place, you'll break through barriers with an army of leaders in place. And that means you're ready for, I don't know, Sean, so many churches now are really embracing multisite as a growth strategy.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest things in multi-site is you have to have a strong leadership bench. So the work now at this
Yeah.
size, as you're trying to break through that barrier, will set you up in the future.
I think our last Unstuck church report is 74% of churches over 2,000 in attendance were
Wow,
multi-site
that
in that
sounds right.
report. So yeah,
Hmm.
you're exactly right. That's 3/4 of the churches that are taking advantage of that strategy. Yeah.
It makes sense. It's been working. It's been around for a couple of decades now, and
Hmm.
it certainly is yielding um, successful fruit. Meaning, we know that church plants sometimes are hit or miss. Multi-site's just kind of
Hmm.
a new way to go after that. So, one of
Yeah.
the things I hear from churches is sometimes leadership development just feels so mysterious. Like, what is it?
Hmm.
And this is why I think we
Hmm.
need to tap someone to really get schooled in this. And there are resources, there's books, it's all over everywhere. But I'll just give you some examples of how some churches have kind of ignited this leadership development. Sometimes they internally use like a cohort style of training for team members that have high leadership giftings, meaning they look at of all of our staff team, pick 10 to 12. Who would we really want to invest in their leadership? And by the way, they've used these cohort style things with volunteers as well. But basically, you have a couple of leaders who are sharing information, sharing leadership practices, giving assignments, and really just beginning to hone in on what does it look like to lead instead of do. Another
Yeah.
example with leadership development, these churches who have been able to get this flywheel going, they brought clarity to the win for the leaders of ministry, right? They say things like, you may be the kids pastor, but you are primarily a team builder. So you get clarity around what's the win for that role. And we have to shift the win from the things that people do to the things that people give away. And I always remember our friend and founder, Tony Morgan. He was at New Spring Church, and he was kind of the catalyst for their multi-site launches, and talked about how the discipline they had as when they were launching campuses, they just had these huge boards of Post-it notes that built down what are all the potential leadership and volunteer roles that we need, and they'd put them in different color orders. And even if they didn't have the person yet, then you just write your name on there until you get it filled. But it created this picture of I'm leading a ministry. I'm not doing ministry. I
Yeah.
am leading a ministry. So those are just some
That's good.
thoughts to get going on that. The
Love
second key practice I would say is that they redesign their organizational structure to support better growth. So you know this, I work with a lot of churches on their organizational structure. And when these churches redesign their organizational structure, here's some of my most common advice. And we were just alluding to it a few minutes ago. First thing in a restructure is you need to get the lead pastor focused on the lead pastor's essential duties. And we often refer to these as the 4 things a senior pastor can't delegate. Here's what I know. When you're growing, trying to break through 1,000, trying to break through 2,000, it's easy for the senior pastor to continue to pick up responsibilities and things to do. But we want the senior pastor focused on being a spiritual leader and leading the teaching team, the primary vision caster, the leader of leaders on the team, right? Working with that senior leadership team and being the the champion of culture. Almost everything else can be delegated. So that's the first most common bit of advice I give these churches. And these are ones in that 1 to 2 to 3,000 range. Second is that they need to bring clarity to the leadership roles and responsibilities on the team. The structure that they need to move to, typically, we need to get the structure built with clear ministry lanes and have clarity on those responsibilities. And when we do this right, then every leader knows what they own and they understand what their teammates own and then how all the work integrates together. So that's the second key thing. The third thing, most common advice, is we need to make sure leaders are actually in leadership positions. Often at this size, Sean, I just see that churches have several team members that have been faithful, loyal, and willing to do whatever it takes to move the mission forward. And oftentimes, many of those people, they just don't have a high enough leadership capacity. So some early staff members may need to transition to a different role that better aligns with their gifting. We're not saying fire everybody. We're just saying we have to guard those leadership roles to make sure we put leaders in there. Otherwise, that's going to be the lid to our growth, honestly. And then the last common work I do when I'm helping churches with their structures is taking the opportunity to get a team to an appropriate span of care. Often either the lead pastor or the executive pastor, they just have too many direct reports. And by addressing span of care, it helps every leader on the team get to a capacity where they can lead, manage, and coach their direct reports more effectively. So let me just show you an org chart real quick, a couple of them here. So this first one, you can see the church is they're trying to break the 2,000 barrier, 1,780 people. And they actually, ironically, have a very high attendee to staff ratio. So they hire one full-time person for every 130 people that attend their church. And again, just do the math really quick. If you were average from our Unstuck church report, that means instead of 14 full-time equivalents, this church would have, 42 full-time equivalents. Okay, so it's amazing how that math goes. So, I mean, if you don't know your attendee to staff ratio, you should know it. But this happened to be a very lean church. They actually hired me because they were growing and they kind of knew we need to figure out what roles we need on the team. So you can see they started here, and the senior pastor has no executive pastor yet. And I often install that role somewhere around the 1,000 in attendance role. So he had 6 direct reports. And anyways, he couldn't do what only he could do. He was kind of acting as the senior pastor and the executive pastor.
Yeah.
So if we go down to the recommendations, these are the recommendations as they grow past that 2,000 barrier to 2,300. The changes that we made. So you can see I actually recommended they drop their attendee to staff ratio. They needed to make room
Hmm.
for some new leaders on the team. And you can see those clear ministry lanes now of operations, weekend, next steps, and next gen. So that's an example, but let me show you this next one. So this is a church I worked with. You can see again, they're at about 1,700 people. Their attendee to staff was more in line with our Unstuck church report at 49 to 1. But I mean, as you look at this, and if you were just to study where all the positions are, you would see that ministry lanes are not clear. In fact, they're kind of
Yeah.
scrambled between a pastor and an associate pastor. And if you look at the executive pastor lane, he's got a lot of direct reports, including a school superintendent for the school that's run alongside the church. And so when I
Hmm.
worked with them, we talked just about a phase one build out here to get some ministry lanes actually created and to get that lead pastor at the time. I mean, it's just 3 direct reports, but again, it was pulling him away from those things that he can't delegate. So we restructured to get that
Hmm.
executive pastor kind of an umbrella over those ministry lanes and to make some progress. I often tell churches we don't have to reach perfection in a restructure, but let's try to make some progress on some of the numbers and the way that we're organizing staff. So hopefully that's helpful just to see a little bit of how we start to implement some of those practices.
It is.
Lastly, the most successful churches at this size, they also prioritize planning time. That's again, they're not just working in the ministry, but they're working on it with dedicated time for strategy development and evaluation. And I know that doesn't sound very churchy, um, but pausing and thinking together as a team annually and quarterly, it'll help you identify the top work that needs to be focused on. Our work is important. It's probably the most important work in the world. We need time to focus in and figure out what are the most important things we need to do. It'll help us create a dashboard that helps us stay focused on what the wins are. And it provides
Yeah.
focus and accountability for an organization. We have to remember
Hmm.
nobody drifts to a place of health. You need to be intentional. So those were mine, Sean. Any thoughts
That's
you
good.
have?
That's really good. Well, I want to talk about one of my favorite topics for just a minute: church finances. Are you excited, Amy?
Thought you might say the Minnesota Vikings.
Well, I was going to go there next, but no, not
Okay.
quite. What I found is that churches that break through these barriers, they focus on creating, I just call them sustainable financial models, moving away from that more kind of reactive budget
Mm-hmm.
to strategic financial planning to really support their mission. And so just there's 4 simple areas that I want to talk about. I'm going to give some kind of quick bullet points on what can happen in each of these areas. So let me go through this fairly quick and then we'll move on with the conversation. First of all, these churches clarify the win before they fund it. And you just just mentioned this, Amy, but these churches are defining their organizational goals that they're
Mm-hmm.
pursuing, goals like number of first time guests, engagement in groups, the baptisms that they're seeing, what their leadership pipeline looks like. And then they're translating those into what we encourage them to look at 3 initiatives. Budget follows priority. And if everything's a priority, nothing is. So what are our top 3 initiatives as a church this next year that we're going to align our resources around? And then build a simple scorecard out and review it on a monthly basis. Money should move toward what is moving the mission of the
Mm-hmm.
church. And churches that are experiencing breakthroughs in these growth areas are focusing their resources around what moves the mission. Rebuild your budget if you're not doing this right now around some of those core ministry initiatives, not around department or what last year's spending looks like, but what are our goals and what are the initiatives to drive those goals? We'll rebuild our budget around that. The second thing these churches are doing is they set healthy financial guardrails. We always encourage churches to target kind of that 8 to 12 weeks of average expenses for cash reserves. We need to have some cash on hand just in case something goes wrong, and we'll be prepared for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think churches should be looking at receiving no more than 20% of their income, of their giving, from their top 10 donors. And if the concentration gets too high with your top donors, You really need to prioritize, and it's a good indication that you haven't,
Mm-hmm.
broadening the giving and the generosity to the broader base of your church,
Mm-hmm.
clarifying the next steps there and focusing on reoccurring giving. Many churches are struggling to re-engage or to engage a broader base of givers. And that's a great area of focus, strategic focus for churches. The
Mm-hmm.
other is just managing debt, especially for growing churches. It could be very easy to take on a lot of debt in this season if you're looking at expanding the footprint of your building. Maybe if you're going multi-site and you overbuild
Right. Right.
somewhere else. So keeping just total facility costs and debt under 25 to 30% of the budget will be really important. If you're over, you're going to have to look at slowing some hiring, reducing some of your ministry budget areas. And that's tough to do in growing ministry seasons like this.
Mm-hmm.
The third thing is they right size staff to attendance. And Amy, you've talked about this a bit already. But looking at those healthy benchmarks, total staffing costs should be somewhere between 45 and 55% of the total operating budget.
Mm-hmm.
Lower is better, but if you're in the growth mode, you may push that just a little bit higher for a season. One of those churches you encourage to kind of do a little more hiring to get in front of
Yep.
the growth. That's
Yep.
okay. Monitoring that staffing to attendance ratio as well, like you mentioned. That healthy target is around 1 FTE for every 75 in weekly attendance. We need to keep an eye on that. Many churches, Amy, I'm finding, are surprised by their true FTE count within their church.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Mm-hmm.
surprised by that ratio as we go through the data. So a simple step for churches is just doing the math. Looking at our total number of FTEs and what our FTE attendance is currently is really important. And then the last thing, let me just mention, they communicate with clarity and consistency. Many churches I've found have drifted away from communicating clearly about finances and budgeting and
Mm-hmm.
being honest and transparent with their church. Not intentionally, they just feel like that's an uncomfortable conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So with your staff, I think you have to communicate and tie dollars to the strategy routinely so that your team and your staff really understand the implications of that. With your board, you've got to provide those trend lines, not just short snapshots, but bigger picture. Invite your board to have conversation and input into those guardrails. And then lastly, with the congregation, share the vision of where you're going with the church.
Mm-hmm.
Celebrate the impact that your ministry's having. Be appropriately transparent about the financial health of your church, what you have in reserves and why you have it there, how you're being a good steward with the resources, what big moves you're considering, what your initiatives are, what debt reduction looks like. People will really appreciate the transparency and clarity
Mm-hmm.
and communication. Let me just say too, I just threw out a lot of different financial statistics that your church could be monitoring. There's actually a great tool that we've run into, and a number of churches are already using it, called Mortarstone. Mortarstone will help you to analyze your financial data. They have a really powerful tool, but more importantly, a great team who wants to help get into the data with you and really
Mm-hmm.
understand how it can help you make decisions. So if you're a church that is doesn't have full understanding of why some things are happening financially within your church and some of the generosity patterns, I'd
Mm-hmm.
encourage you to reach out to Mortarstone. They'd be a great resource for you.
Yeah, they are great. Hey, before we move on, we're kind of under this umbrella of key practices that churches do that break through these barriers. So before we move on, I just want to go back to leadership development for a moment because it's so important. Your approach needs to fundamentally change at these larger sizes, how you lead, how you do ministry. And instead of the senior pastor directly developing everyone, churches actually need to create a culture where leaders develop other leaders. So this means
Hmm.
you need to build a culture of leadership development. This is where I always go back to, we need to make sure we're celebrating staff for what they give away, not what they do, right? What gets
That's
noticed
good.
gets
Yeah.
repeated. And I was just with a team and they're like, ooh, at our staff meeting every week, we're kind of celebrating the busy people. And I'm like, you got to celebrate
Hmm.
what they give away, not what they do themselves. You also need, you need to get those leaders in leadership roles. You need leaders who can build systems and equip others, not just managers who maintain the status quo in your ministry area. And so I say that because You need to have a clear way to evaluate leadership capacity. Not every employee, team member has the same leadership capacity. In the Unstuck process, we actually use a leadership capacity tool, and it defines 5 tiers of leadership capacity. So the leaders of self, the leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. And as we go through that, we work with the leaders to kind of say, where are our leaders? Like, where is their leadership capacity today? We do it person by person. And then what is their potential? And that just gives us a roadmap to go, these are the people that we're ready to give a stretch assignment to. Boy, that person is a leader of tens and we've got him or her in a leader of hundreds role. We probably need to make a shift of some sort. So have some clear way to evaluate that leadership capacity. So you're not just, like trying to figure out or use your gut on that one. And the last part here is also, I think it kind of came out of my example with Tony and all of his Post-its for launching multi-site churches. But you need to actually know how many volunteer leaders you have and identify how many you actually need. That probably goes for volunteers too, right? So you need to know how many volunteer leaders do I need, for example, in first impressions, and then how many volunteers would be on their teams. And we're always trying to get those ratios like 1 to 10. Like, let's get a team leader over 10 volunteers. Let's get a coach over 10 team leaders, just so that we have a healthy span of care there as well. So we need to create pathways for volunteers to step into leadership positions. Otherwise, we're leaving so many leadership gifts on the table that God brought to our church. So again, staff don't have to do all the ministries. Staff need to conduct and create opportunities for people to do it. So the reason I came back to it is because when churches hit the 2,000 barrier, they absolutely must have a leadership pipeline in place, or growth will stall due to leadership limitations.
Yeah, that's so true. That's great. Well, we're going to give you just a couple of seconds here again to reflect. And I want you to take that PDF workbook that you downloaded, write down one practice that your church needs to focus on developing and implementing in the coming months that will start removing the growth barrier that you feel like you're facing right now. So about 30 seconds, use your workbook, and then we'll be back with the third step in today's conversation. All right, Amy, as we wrap up today's webinar, churches are working to break through these growth barriers. So what are the vital signs that they should be monitoring just to make sure that they're actually making progress?
Absolutely. Well, attendance may be the metric that feels the most obvious, but attendance alone never tells the whole story. So I'm going to have you show this vital signs report here, Sean, really quick, and just to walk through it. So when we do a vital signs assessment, we try to have a mix of metrics that tell us how we're doing at reaching new people, and we have some metrics that tell us how well are we doing at helping them follow Christ, right, and take their next steps. And what I like about this is that, again, no one metric is going to tell the story. It's how all of these work together. So you can see this church here. They're a church of just about 3,000, but their total attendance change year over year is sitting here at 2%. And they're feeling that. That's probably why they called us. It's softening. And you can see this online engagement. That is characteristics. When this number is low, it eventually creates a drag on the total attendance change. Percentage of baptisms is a great one to see if new people are crossing the line of faith. And so that's a bright spot, right? They're only 2% growth year over year, but there's fruit in the work that they're doing. Percentage of kids, this is often a great indication of if we have a church that's reaching the next generation. Benchmark is 20%. Let me jump down to percentage of adults and student in serving, as well as the groups numbers. These are great indicators, and you can see the benchmarks are 50% and 55% respectively. But honestly, if these numbers get too high, they often tell a story that we are not reaching enough new people, and going back up to this 2% growth that they had, that we are not offsetting those numbers with new people. And then you see the metric, Sean, that you were just talking about. The attendance to staff, this church is sitting at 37 to 1, which is quite low. and their percentage of budget spent on staff is sitting at 72%. So I share all that to say you need to understand what your metrics are doing and what they're telling you. And by the way, most of those metrics we just went through, they're lag measures, right? They're showing you the results of what has already happened. So like in sports, right?
Yeah.
The final score, that's a lag measure. But smart churches also track lead measures or lead activities. And lead activities are just the things that you have control over that have the potential to impact the lag measure in a positive way. And this concept, again, comes from 4 disciplines of execution. But Journey Church in Newark, Delaware, they used lead measures when they were onboarding a new campus pastor to their team. This campus pastor had leaders and volunteers to recruit as they prepared to launch to this new location. And so his lead activity was something like 100 cups of coffee a month. Now that's a lot to drink, right?
But that sounds like fun, actually.
Yeah, go have 100 cups of coffee in 30 days. And again, I'm kind of making up the number, but I think I'm in the ballpark because ultimately he didn't have control over how many volunteers and volunteer leaders would raise their hand to join him. But those 100 cups of coffee, that lead activity, set him up to have a better result than if he hadn't done that. So back to the metrics. The important thing here is that your metrics are telling you a story. The data is telling us about the effectiveness of our ministry strategies. Stuck churches monitor activity. Healthy, growing churches monitor impact. So what does that look like? Well, first, as you said, Sean, just a minute ago, you need to set some goals for each of these vital sign areas. Like, how many people do we think we're going to reach next year? How many people do we want to take that step of baptism? How many volunteers and volunteer leaders do we engage in ministry, groups, generosity? You get the picture. But these goals then define success for you, right? It just sets a target for you organizationally to go, this is what we believe we're trusting God for. The next step then is to go, how do we evaluate the how, right? So if we're expecting to baptize 300 people next year, what's our strategy for that? How are we going to talk about it? What are our ministry strategies? At our church, we always plan to grow 20% year over year. And our main strategy to do that was with our weekend service. So every year we asked ourselves, is our weekend, is it set up to help us grow another 20%? Is it effective enough? And if we thought something might need to be changed or tweaked, that's when we worked through any of those changes. If you're trusting that you will engage 200 volunteer leaders in ministry next year, the next question to ask is, what's our strategy to accomplish that, right? So your lag indicators, your metrics will tell you what strategies are and are not working. Sean, it actually it reminds me, last year we had Shelley Dameron on our Reach and Retain webinar. Do you remember that? And she shared how their strategy to engage new people, it wasn't working. Their strategy to help people take those first steps and become known at the church, it wasn't working anymore. Pre-COVID, they saw 50 to 60 people taking that step each month. Post-COVID, early 2024, she said 6 to 8 people were now taking that step. And she shared that her data was saying, I may be screaming, our first step engagement strategy is no longer working, right? So what did they do? They did some R&D and they redesigned what that strategy was. Today, they're seeing 80 to 100 people take that step each month. And in turn, they have seen a 750% jump in people taking big next steps, like to serve, to get baptized, to get in a group. And so what they're so good and so disciplined at Orchard Church is letting their data tell them a story, and then they respond to that. So do you know your numbers?
That's so great.
Are you setting goals before locking into a strategy?
Just remember that breaking these barriers is not just about growth in numbers. It's also about growth in health and in the mission impact. The goal for us, if you think back to the church life cycle, is to live and sustain health. And that is a really fun place to be on an ongoing basis. So that's really what we're trying to get at and measure as we go through this conversation. I want to encourage you to jump back to your workbook one last time. And in just the next 30 seconds, identify and circle the vital sign your church is monitoring now, and star the ones that you need to start monitoring more intentionally in the future. So a circle around the vital signs you're currently monitoring, a star around the ones you need to be more intentional about in the future.
God the glory, glory, rise, shine. Give God the glory. Oh, rise, shine.
On earth as it is in heaven.
Give God the glory. Oh, rise, shine. Give God the glory. Oh, rise, shine. Give God the glory. Rise, shine. Give God the glory. Rise, shine.
We got a runner.